Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and welcome back to another unit roster overview, as we'll be taking a look at the Kislev roster today. With exactly 19 units spread across 6 categories, Kislev has a diverse roster featuring traditional as well as magical weapons, symbolizing the divide among the Kislev court following Boris's disappearance. And kicking things off today, we have the Armoured Kossars at 650 costs, which is going to be the cheapest infantry option. Now, despite being the cheapest infantry option, there are only 90 units per retinue here, which is reflected pretty much throughout the Kislev roster. Not a lot of units per retinue, and it's not a bad thing because you still have a decent amount of health. So per unit health is going to be pretty healthy. 125 mass, definitely not low, but it is what it is for infantry. Armor, 80, pretty decent. They have a very good shield, and it's reflected by a 55% range block chance from the front. Leadership is pretty high at 65. Slow speed, because these are hybrid units, you can see the pistol in their hand, and that is because they want to stand still and utilize their ranged weapon before they engage in melee, or perhaps get engaged in melee, as they tend to be a bit more defensive focused with 38 melee defense versus 32 melee attack. And in terms of the ranged weapon, 6 ammo, that's pretty good for a mainly infantry unit. 90 range is a bit low, but understandable since it's a pistol. Missile strength is not bad. 18-7 breakdown, mainly base damage, 9.9 second reload time. And in terms of their weapon strength, we're looking at 32, breakdown to 23 base damage and 9 armor piercing. So even though it's mostly base damage for both the melee and the range component, their overall damage is not bad on these units, and they have a decent amount of defensive stats, so they're definitely a great frontline option. And speaking of great frontline option, pretty much every single unit within the Kislev roster will have By Our Blood. And this is a passive augment ability, or a passive buff, that will kick in when your leadership is wavering or lower than that. And it will last 30 seconds, where you become unbreakable. It is one use only. For those of you who have seen my Three Kingdoms content or are familiar with Three Kingdoms, these are found on the Face Divided units, which are the Qingrou units added to Cao Cao's roster. Misplaced Devotion. It's a very powerful bonus where essentially all your units become unbreakable for a limited amount of time, where they can try to win their fight and survive and fight again after it wears out, because you don't rout after 30 seconds. You basically will have to take a look at where your leadership is after that 30 seconds. Perhaps you pulled this unit away from danger, perhaps you overcame your danger, perhaps you simply dipped to wavering because the enemy used a spell to lower your leadership, and that spell has expired after 30 seconds. So regardless of the conditions, it gives you a chance, and allows your units to dish out damage without worrying about routing or shattering and get chased down for those 30 seconds. And it's a very powerful bonus. I think this is actually super strong and make Kislev one of the stronger factions in the game because of it. So as we move up to 700 costs, we have the Great Weapon variant of the Armoured Kossars. So we traded away our axe and shield, and now as you can see, we're holding a Great Mace. And the main difference here is we lose the shield. The unit number plus mass is still the same. We have the same guys with the same health, same leadership, same speed. Melee attack goes up, melee defense goes down. So we're sacrificing defensive stats in terms of range block chance and melee defense for a small boost in melee attack, and of course better weapon strength of 36. It's not much higher in terms of just raw value, but most of this is going to be armor piercing damage at 25 and only 11 base damage. The pistol is exactly the same, and unlike most great weapon units, there is no bonus to certain type of enemy, so no bonus against enemy infantry or enemy large. They also don't have any sort of charge reflect to save them or to utilize their great weapon. It's a mace, so you're trading off pretty much most of the useful defensive stat, which I actually don't like. So I typically prefer just the regular Armoured Kossars. Here you're basically better off against heavily armored foes, and that's pretty much it. Which in some instances will be useful, just not every single instance. Abilities the same, we can hide, and we have By Our Blood. Moving up to 1000 cost, we have the Tzar Guard, who visually will look very similar to the Armoured Kossar. We pretty much gave up our axe and traded it for a saber, and we no longer have the pistol. So these are pure melee units. We also drop from 90 units per retinue to 80, but we become more massive at 150, and our total health actually goes up, which means our per unit health actually goes up by a lot more. We're mainly focused on melee combat, so it's no surprising to find we have slightly more armor at 90, slightly more leadership, same speed, a slight improvement in melee attack compared to the basic Armoured Kossar, but slightly lower than the Great Weapon variant. Much higher melee defense. These are your key defensive frontline units. Weapon strength goes to 36, most of it being base damage, 26 and 10. So against heavily armored foes, you're not going to be doing that much damage, but you're very good at holding the line with 50 points of melee defense. Charge bonus, not much to speak of in terms of abilities, still the basic hide plus buy our blood. Finally, at 1100 cost, we have the Tzar Guard with a great weapon, and this is going to be the most elite variant of infantry available to the Kislev roster, and we have a different weapon on the Tzar Guard, now a great sword. And this is actually a decent improvement. We do give up the shield, we do give up massive amount of melee defense, we don't gain much melee attack back for it, but we do have a bonus damage against infantry of 10 points, and most of the damage shift towards armor piercing, so the offensive power actually goes up by quite a bit. Charge goes up by a little bit, we still have the same set of abilities, so finally we have sort of a unit with a specialized role of anti-infantry. Moving on to the missile infantry, we start at 450 cost with the Kossars. So these guys are not armored from their name, and you can see by their armor stats of just 15. They have 90 per unit at pretty much the lowest mass of 100. I think we seen maybe units like Nurglings with less than 100, but overall this is pretty much as low as you can go for humans. Leadership of 60 is actually decently high, a little bit faster without the armor, but still a slow unit. Melee attack 28, 26, these are actually not terrible stats, we'll explain a bit later. Weapon strength, they carry an axe, so 21-7 here, also not too bad. Charge bonus is a tad low since this is mainly your range unit. 20 ammo, pretty default here, 140 range, actually not half bad for a bow unit. 19 missile strength with 3 points of it being armor piercing, 9.9 second reload time, so 16-3 split. Obviously most of the damage is going to be base, but compared to say the peasant archers of Grand Cathay, which only has 1 point of armor piercing damage, this is really not that bad. And pretty much as a human unit of Kislev, we will have buy our blood to boost ourselves for the last 30 seconds when our morale or when our leadership dips down. Overall, pretty nice unit. Moving up in cost by a little bit to 500 cost, we have the Kossar again, except for this time we have a spear instead of an axe for our melee weapon. And if we look at the stats here, it's actually worse compared to the axe variant. We actually lose melee attack. We will gain a bit of melee defense to make up for it, but we actually lose quite a bit of melee attack. It's only 20 points now. Weapon strength, it's pretty interesting here. The damage is not changed too much, 20 and 5, so no armor piercing on these spear, but they do get a pretty big bonus against large, so that's what you should really focus these units as. The bow part is exactly the same. They're really meant as an anti-large design, and they're going to be the first unit so far we see with charge defense against large, making them negate the charge bonus of any large attackers, as well as charge reflection, which allow them to basically deal double damage back to a charging enemy. It's a pretty good combination when you know the enemy have large units. Aside from that, just looking at raw stats, if you're not fighting a large enemy, then the basic Kossar is going to do better than the spear variant here. So it's a very specialized unit that's very similar in cost as its regular variant, and that's something you need to be mindful of when recruiting these guys. Then jumping to 850 in cost, we have the Streltsis. Now these are very, very fun units because they have a weapon that's a gun or rifle plus an axe on it at the butt end, and that's a dual weapon capability here, a gun great axe infantry. Drawing from historical references, it doesn't make physical sense because the point of having an axe and a gun for these units historically is the gun was too heavy to hold steady when you are trying to shoot it. So the axe was sort of the stand, a separate weapon. And when you get into close combat, you don't load your musket, you just pull the axe up from the ground and start swinging it. So you can counter enemy cavalry who could approach you quickly. Here, we are definitely strong enough to hold the gun steady because we have an extra weight at the butt end with the axe and we can swing with it. So it's just a cool unit. Can't really complain. We have 90 units per retinue, 125 mass. The health is same as the range units we seen earlier, so not super high. They're not, tankier because of extra health. They're just tankier because they're wearing armor. And we have 70 point of armor here for these guys. Leadership of 70 is quite high. Slow speed makes sense now they're wearing heavy armor. Melee attack, melee defense, pretty good at 28 points each, since they are expected to be in melee with their axe. 34 damage, with most of it being armor piercing. 9 base, 25. We're talking about the axe part here. Charge bonus is quite low, because you want to use these as a range unit with 20 ammo, 140 range. So they will actually match the range of the archers, which is kind of nice. Missile strength, it's going to be 5 and 17 actually. The reload speed's a little low, which is why the missile strength look a bit low here. 11.7 seconds, but it has very high armor piercing damage here at 17. So overall, pretty good unit. Ability wise, just the same, hide in forest and buy our blood to give them a boost at the end there. Moving up to 1150 cost, we have the sword variant of the Ice Guard. These are dual weapon users again. Hybrid weapon is quite popular among the Kislev roster. You have pistol and axes, you have bow and axes, bow and spears, and now you have magical bows and magical dual swords for these units here. And they're magical not because they just look cool, but they have magical attack stats on both the range and the melee weapon. And on top of that, both of them will apply something called Frostbite, lowering enemy speed by 30%, which is actually quite good because you basically increase the amount of time you have to shoot them at 160 range. The missile strength is pretty good, 18.6 the breakdown, 9.0 reload speed, which is quite fast, 22 ammo, a little bit extra on that as well. There's only 80 of them, so that part's a little bit lacking compared to the 90 we saw with the Streltsi. But here, 100 mass, a little bit more health. Less unit means per unit health actually goes up. They're not wearing too much armor at 40 points. Leadership is quite high at 75. Good speed at 36 compared to what's seen earlier, mainly due to the fact they're lightly armored, but they're still faster than the sort of no armor Kossars, which is a good thing. High melee attack, high melee defense. They're very capable in combat, and they actually have a bonus against infantry, so they can definitely get dirty. And that's 9 points of bonus damage against infantry. Base weapon damage is 22 and 10. We'll also apply that magic attack to bypass any physical resistances, as well as the frostbite to slow them down once you do hit them. So those are all very interesting bonuses. Abilities, there's one extra for these Ice Guards, and that's immune to psychology. So fear and terror will not work on these guys, or girls, as we should say, as these are female units. And finally, at 1250 cost, we have the Glaive variant of the Ice Guards. Stat-wise, we're going to be very similar. We're just trading in our weapon of the dual sword for a Glaive. That's going to give us anti-large. So we're going to keep our focus on the weapon's strength. And here we have an 820 breakdown between base and armor piercing on the Glaive. And we have a bonus against large of 17 points. And that's going to be complemented by a charge defense against large and a charge reflection. So this is kind of your frontline alternative against enemy large units compared to the sword variant or the dual sword variant of the Ice Guard. Then switching things up to the cavalry, we start out with the Kossovite Dervishes, which is going to be the cheapest cavalry unit in the game and also the cheapest unit for the Kislev faction at 450 cost. These are your definition of a light cavalry, 60 per retinue, mass of just 600, so not a lot of knockback on these guys. We also pretty much don't have armor. Leadership of 60, it's not low, but for Kislev it's actually pretty low. All the units we've seen so far have at least 60. They have good leadership across the board and also compounded with by our blood for all the human units. Decent speed of 92, not the fastest. Light cavalry typically have 95. 92 is actually a strange number here. Melee attack and melee defense is okay. Weapon strength of 28 is not bad. 21 and 7 in terms of split, and charge bonus of 40. It's just these guys are super fragile, not a lot of mass. You're really only going to use these guys for chase down purposes. Vanguard deployment on them in terms of abilities. We have the same setup of hide and by our blood on top of that. So just be careful with them, because this is not Three Kingdoms. Cavalry just don't break down infantry as much as you expect, and with very little health, you're not going to survive a lot of engagements that you will have to sustain fight. It's good if you're chasing down a routed unit. They're very good for that. Aside from that, just keep them safe until you can find an opportunity to get some shock damage on the enemy. Then moving up to 850 cost, we have the Winged Lancers, and these are going to be our heavier cavalry. I wouldn't call them heavy cavalry just yet. We only have a mass of 900 with 60 units. Health goes up by a little bit. We are decently armored at 80, and we have a small shield that will cover 30% of frontal small arms missile fire. Leadership once again is pretty high. Speed is still relatively high, so the trade-off between having some armor and shield is pretty good given how much speed we retained compared to a lot of the pure heavy cavalry options for other factions, which speed goes down to about 50 or 60. 84 speed is actually quite good. Melee attack and melee defense is not so hot at 26 each. Weapon strength of 30, 21-9 breakdown between base and armor piercing. Charge bonus is good, and on top of that, we will cause fear, which does help with leadership hits. And we also have by our blood, but just note, these are not really heavy cavalries. You still kind of want to treat them as semi-light, even though you do have a decent amount of armor. Just low health cavalry just don't do as much, and if you keep them in sustained combat, they won't come out ahead most of the time, given how bad the melee attack and melee defense is. So look for opportunities to get off your charge bonus and then pull them out, or have them chase down enemy routing units, because 84 speed is still quite fast, and they're going to be good with that option. Then jumping all the way to 1200 cost, we finally have our heavy shot cavalry in the Gryphon Legion. And these are going to have 100 armor with a shield that will block 30%. It's a cooler looking shield, but it's just some variations. I think some of them have bones, some of them don't. It's going to be still 60 unit. The mass is still going to be 900, but obviously we have a lot more armor, which reduces our speed to 75, which is still very respectable actually. And the reason for all of this is because we also ride bears, which you will see very soon, which is why our speed is still good on horses and our mass doesn't go up that much. In terms of melee attack and defense, it gets a lot better at 34, 32. Weapon strength goes up by a bit as well. 40 points total between 28 base and 12 points of armor piercing, and we have 72 charge bonus. So all these are very positive, and we keep the cause fear, and we have the same sort of abilities as well with by our blood and hide. And since we already talked about bears, we have the War Bear Riders at 1600 cost for the most expensive cavalry unit for Kislev, and these will have only 16 units per retinue, but the mass jumps up to 1700. And I guess this can be your sort of heavy shot cavalry if you want to consider these cavalry. This is a very nice unit. 95 armor, still quite high. No shield on the rider on top. Leadership of 70 is quite good. Speed actually doesn't go down by much. So we're still at 75 with almost double the math of the Gryphon Legion that we just saw. So that's very, very positive. 46 melee attack, very, very high. Defensively speaking, not so much, but we have ton of health per unit because we went down to 16 and our health jumped almost by 2k. So the per unit health is just massive. Weapon gets a lot better as well. We have 110 weapon strength. Of course, you have to consider we are not 60 unit anymore, so there's definitely some correlation there. It does look like a big number, and it is. 33, 77, with 77 of it being armor piercing. That's very, very positive. And we also get a bonus against large of 23 points on top of that. So all great things. Charge bonus goes down by quite a bit though. So 38 here. And the reason is we don't really need to rely on the charge bonus from the first, 10 seconds or so of the charge to dish out our damage, because our melee attack is actually very good. Our weapon strength is very good. So these guys will do okay in sustained combat. You don't need to cycle charge these boys. Get them in there, get the initial knockback from your heavy mass, and then just keep fighting. We'll also cause fear, hide, and we still have by our blood. Then moving on to range cavalry, we have the horse archer. at 600 cost. It's quite cheap. We don't have armor. There's 60 of us with 600 mass. Health goes down, so this is very similar to the Kossovite Dervishes, except for we're now using a bow mainly as our weapon. 140 range, 19 damage is the same as the Kossar stats, so nothing new here. Only 18 ammo. We have okay charge, bonus 30. In terms of melee attack and melee defense, not super high, of course. Speed is 92, so top end low armor speed. 60 leadership, the low end of Kislev action, but still pretty high in terms of base value. Weapon strength of 28, 21-7 breakdown here. So very similar to the melee variant, except we just have a bow that's going to match the Kossar bow strength on the ground with slightly less ammo. Ability wise, we can fire while moving, so we can sort of kite enemies around. We have By Our Blood, Vanguard deployment, and the ability to hide. Then things get a little bit more interesting. At 950 cost, we have the Light War Sled. And as someone asked me, does Kislev only have polar bears? No, they have brown bears as well, as they pull the Light War Sleds here, which are these magical ice sleds pulled by 2 giant bears, which gives them quite a bit of mass of 3,500, which makes sense because 1 bear is 1,700. So 2 bear plus a sled, 3,500. There's going to be 4 of them for the ultra unit size, which is what we're showing everyone here for all the unit roster overviews. Decent amount of health, so per unit health is great. You have a bunch of guys in the back with guns, and that's going to be your main damage here as a range cavalry option or range chariot option, to be honest. 140 range, so we are holding the Streltsi rifle with the axe on the butt end, as you can see from the visuals here. 38 damage, most of it's going to be armor piercing, 10.34 point breakdown, slow reload of 11.7. We have a ton of ammo, 120. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous high. You're never going to run out. And you have fire while moving as well. Charge bonus is pretty high because you are still a chariot unit with bears pulling you. Weapon strength on these guys are going to be the same as the weapon strength you saw earlier on the War Bear Riders, the 110 breakdown, except for you're not anti-large, you're now anti-infantry of 20, which makes sense because you want chariots to charge into a cluster of infantry and do your damage. Most of it's going to be armor piercing damage, which is great. The melee attack and melee defense is not so high, so you might want to utilize that with your charge bonus for when you don't want to fire anymore, which it's going to be weird because the range damage is not bad and there's multiple guys in the back firing. I think there's at least 4 per sled, so that's still 16 of them shooting. And with such high ammo, the range damage is not bad. The speed is not bad either at 75. So you could technically kite with these guys with fire while moving. 70 armor, 70 leadership. Overall, just a very fun unit here. And we will keep Cause Fear and By Our Blood. I think pretty much all the bear unit have Cause Fear, and every single human unit that has a human in it will have By Our Blood. And of course, if we have a light war sled, we have a heavy war sled as well at 1350 cost, and now we're back to polar bears. The mass is going to be slightly heavier, 4100 here, as our cart now has sort of the Wing Lancer's wings on the back of them. Maybe that's adding weight. We're heavily armored now. I guess this will be on the bear or on the chariot. It's kind of hard to tell visually why we suddenly have 110 armor, but we do, and that's going to slow us down to 66. So relatively closer to a lot of the shock cavalry stats for other factions. Still a very fast target here. 38 melee attack for when we do get into melee fights. Same damage in melee, same bonus against infantries. Charge bonus goes up a bit. Ammo is still ridiculously high at 120. Same range and the same missile fire setup with most of it being armor piercing. Ability wise, also the same. So essentially you're paying up for a heavier unit with more charge bonus, more armor, and just more, mass for your collision attacks when you do charge into a cluster of infantry for these units compared to the light war sled, which might be better at kiting and using their range capabilities. Now moving on to Monster and Beast, we start out with the Snow Leopard at 650 cost. And this is a single entity unit, which I actually don't like in the game. It's very, very fragile at 3,180 health. and it has the wounds mechanic. Being only a melee user, it's going to hurt it particularly very much. It's easy to lose your health to below 25% because you don't start out with much of it. And once you do hit that point, you lose speed, you lose your weapon damage and your armor piercing weapon damage. But the thing about Snow Leopard is it's specialized for Catherine's faction, because she has a skill on her skill tree that allows all the Snow Leopard in her army to gain stock, which makes them quite useful, because if you look at their stats otherwise, they're super fragile, not only because of low health, but low armor as well, only 20 points. Their leadership isn't very high at 60, which is the lowest in the game, and since they're not a human unit, this is the only unit that does not have some sort of unbreakable mechanic. There is no By Our Blood to supplement its low leadership. Good speed of 100. Obviously, attack is good, and it has frostbite on the attack because it's a magical sort of ice attack, but it doesn't have magical attack on it, which is kind of interesting. So it's a physical attacker with frostbite abilities from sort of the cold that's emitting from its paws, but not magic. It's a little bit confusing, but it's fine. The damage is high. You know, we have 290 damage here, 85, 205 breakdown, so a lot of its armor piercing is good against large with 20 points of bonus. So that's kind of its specialty, maybe as a counter to enemy single entity large unit. If you could swarm them, if you can flank them when they're stocked against enemy range or spellcasters, I think that's usually where they will shine a bit more. You have good charge bonus. The melee attack, as we mentioned, is pretty high already. In terms of abilities, aside from wounds, they will gain 20% physical resistance to kind of make up for some of its weaknesses in terms of lack of armor, causes fear, and has hide. But the beasts do get a lot better as we move on to the most expensive unit in the Kislev roster at 2,200 cost. We have the Elemental Bear, who is also not human, so he does not have By Our Blood, but he has Unbreakable to make up for it. He's huge. Let me try to lift him up a little. And he's a single entity as well, with 9,000 mass. This is the highest number in the game, I believe. I don't think anyone has higher than 9,000. Previously, the Great Unclean One, which we have seen in our Nurgle unit roster overview, has 7,000. That was massive already, but this guy is a lot bigger at 9,000. So he will do a lot of damage charging into the enemy. 90 points of armor, high leadership, what doesn't matter because we are unbreakable, that's why it's 100. 48 speed, so we are a little bit slow. Good melee attack, finally it's magic attack, plus frostbite. Defense is low, we do get hit very easily. We are pretty massive, so only 20 points of melee defense for us. Health is amazing, right? We went from 3k on the Snow Leopard to 10k for a single entity on the Elemental Bear. And if you're talking about special faction mechanics, playing as Boris's faction, you can get regeneration on all your Elemental Bears in his army. So an army of 19 of these guys with Boris is going to be pretty insane, as they can all regenerate infinitely in combat, and that's a lot of health to work with the per second heal, so they can get pretty crazy because it's always a percentage regeneration, and if you have a lot of base health, then the regeneration obviously becomes a lot more valuable. Weapon strength 600, most of it being armor piercing at 150 and 450 breakdown. It's just very good stats. Charge bonus not so heavy, you're not dependent on charge, although collision would do a lot because you have 9,000 mass. Ability wise, we have a spell as well, a 3-use magic missile that would deal explosive range damage and apply frostbite at a 90 meter range. It can use as long as you're out of melee and have line of sight of an enemy target. 60-second cooldown just adds a bit more capabilities to your Elemental Bear. You're considered a siege attacker, surprise surprise, you're so big. Cause fear, cause terror, you're unbreakable. You have the wounds mechanic, this will hurt you, but to drop you down to below 25% takes quite a long time given how much health you have, and we mentioned the regeneration possibilities with Boris. We also have 25% physical resistance to protect us from damages, so even though we have low melee defense, that's not really going to hamper us too much with that resistance on top of the 90 points of armor. So a great unit in the Elemental Bear. And finally, for our last unit in the Kislev roster, we have the little Grom, which is a single entity artillery unit. It's kind of weird to have artillery being single entity. It actually makes it a lot better as an artillery unit in ultra unit size, because most other artilleries scale with unit size. You end up with more on ultra. You can think of this as a land version of, say, the Sky Junk for Grand Cathay, which always have one. So it's kind of interesting. We have a decent amount of mass because we're still pulled by two lovely bears, 2,900 here. We have about half the health as the elemental bear we saw. It's not low, but it's not super high, 5,000. Heavily armored, 105 points. Leadership is good, speed is slow, makes sense, we're hauling a cannon on the back. 40 points of melee attack, not much melee defense, weapon strength. This is mostly going to be just the collision weapon strength from the bear, as you can kind of tell. We're going to have bonus against infantry. It's pretty much the 2 war sleds. Consider this a chariot, but instead of guys with the guns on the back, we have a cannon. Charge bonus, pretty low, because you're not hoping to get in there for a charge. You're hoping to stand still and fire your 22 ammo at a very high range of 450. Missile strength is going to be actually pretty high, 145 base, 580 armor piercing. These guys are pretty accurate. I have tried them out, so they don't really disappoint. The reload speed is pretty long, 14.4, but I can hit single entities from pretty far away, like almost max range, when these guys are like rank 1, so that's always a good sign. In terms of abilities, they're considered siege attacker, they cause fear because of the bears, and because we got one guy manning the artillery, or actually there's 2, I think there's another guy on the back. Yeah, we got 2 guys in the back here, and because they're there, we have By Our Blood, which is super good. But because it's a single entity artillery unit, we actually have wounds, which doesn't affect us that much if you think about it, because it only punishes melee damage. So our cannon's going to be fine. Even if one of these become less than 25% health, let's say we use them in melee first, for example, or if they get caught in melee and you have to fight your way out and you suddenly drop below, 25%, you can still set them up as a long-range artillery and you actually don't lose any value for them. So that's not really going to bother us as a single entity artillery. But overall, that's going to do it for our Kislev roster. And my opinion of the roster overall is it's quite nice, mainly because we have By Our Blood trait shared pretty much with all the unit. Aside from the Snow Leopard, every unit in this roster has some sort of unbreakable in its kit, and that is just super strong in Total War games in general. And considering we also have an unbreakable single entity giant bear with a lot of stats, whether you're playing multiplayer or playing campaign, it's a very powerful unit to have in your roster. And overall, you have units spread across all sorts of categories. All your units seem to have some sort of hybrid weapon capabilities, like even this artillery is decent in melee, for example, or your range infantry have some sort of axe or sword weapon at the ready with the ice guards, for example, or even the Kossars with the anti-frontline, anti-large spear units. And your regular base infantry units all have some sort of pistol as a backup, except for the Tzar Guards. But in general, you have a lot of mixed weapon type. It helps make up for the fact that you have no access to flying. There's no flyers in the roster, so you do have to depend on a lot of these range options to help you put down flyers at a distance, or you have to wait till the flyers pick their target and land on you, and you have to fight your way out on ground at that point. But it does limit some of your flexibilities, but overall, still a pretty solid roster of diverse units, and hopefully you enjoy this unit roster overview. And if you're interested in seeing the roster overview for all the Warhammer factions, definitely consider subscribing to the channel, as I'll be making faction previews, unit roster overviews, and guides covering Total War Warhammer 3 throughout the pre-release period leading up to the launch of the game. So thanks again for watching till the end, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!